Hello and welcome to Week 14, Philosophy 101, in which we will discuss Searle, Chapter 4. Now, since Chapter 5 contains most of the prominent information for social facts, Chapter 4 is going to be relatively short. I like to have a short kind of chapter right before we get into a lot of information. And as I stated before, Searle Chapter 5 is where the bulk of information that we are going to be concerned with is contained. So Chapter 4 is going to be kind of short. I'm only going to highlight the important features for us to gain a solid understanding of intentionality. And one reason I don't spend a lot of time on intentionality is because I'd say 75% of this chapter is just used for his philosophy of science arguments in Chapter 6, a chapter we're not even going to go over nor discuss. This class is more geared towards the epistemology of philosophy. Therefore, we're trying to gain a solid understanding of knowledge, or the criteria for knowledge, as we have with Plato, Descartes, Hume, and now Searle. So the highlights of this chapter is, of course, intentionality. Then we're going to get into intrinsic versus derived intentionality, and what he means by the two. Then I'm going to get into how Searle discusses intentionality as a biological phenomenon, just like consciousness, because that's Searle's aim. Searle is a materialist, so all of the aspects of consciousness is going to come from this kind of materialist angle with a hint of subjectivity. So I'll explain how he describes intentionality as a biological phenomena, just to explain it. And then we're going to go over direction of fit, which is important, mind to world and world to mind direction of fit, conditions of satisfaction, and then finally intentional causation. And with that, let's get right into it with consciousness and intentionality. So to repeat, intentionality is the general term for all various forms by which the mind can be directed at or be about or be of objects and states of affairs in the world. When I am hungry or when I am thirsty, my consciousness seeks out that which can sate my desires. And that is intentionality. The fact that my consciousness is being directed at or seeking food or water within the world for this particular example. For Searle, he states that brain states that are non-conscious can be understood as mental states only to the extent that we understand them as capable in principle of giving rise to conscious states. So those states in which I am sound asleep, it really only makes sense if they can be understood as giving rise to states of consciousness when we are awake. When I am hungry in my sleep, it only makes sense because there exists an intentionality to be hungry when I'm awake, or it has the possibility to give rise to a conscious intentionality when I am awake. So a genuine, unconscious mental state must be at least the sort of state that could be conscious. And he gives a pretty good analogy to make this point clear. When we turn off our computer, all the words and images on the screen completely disappear. But unless he's made like some really big mistake, they don't cease to exist. They're stored on the computer. But the fact that they are still words and pictures, the fact that we know that there still exists my Word document of the pictures that I've saved of my children on the laptop or on the computer, it comes from the fact that the magnetic traces that are within the computer can be converted to words, that can be converted to pictures when I turn the machine back on. We know that they are, in fact, pictures and words simply because they have the capability of becoming pictures and words when I turn the computer back on. And so that's the same thing with my unconscious beliefs. And beliefs is how he got to this train of thought. The fact that he can have a belief that Clinton is president when he is sleeping and that when he wakes up, Clinton is still president. Of course, right now that really doesn't hold water. But for us, for our sake, it's that Barack Obama is president in 2015. So the belief that I have that Barack Obama is president in 2015 is still a belief. It's still a conscious belief. And it exists even when I'm unconscious. But it only exists when I'm unconscious from the point of view that the belief is capable of becoming a conscious belief, a belief that I can still hold in the conscious world. And that's all he means by this first section, in which he wanted to explain how an unconscious belief can still be a belief about the external world. Now, in order for Searle to really get into intentionality, he realizes that we need to distinguish two kinds of intentionality. One that humans and animals have intrinsically from the sort of derived intentionality of words and sentences, pictures, diagrams, and graphs. Because these are two kinds of intentionalities. So the first one he goes over is intrinsic intentionality. And this one is pretty straightforward. But before I get into it, it's good for us to understand what he means by intrinsic. Before we talked about subjectivity, and subjectivity revolves around that which subjective agents give rise to. If I say that pizzaiola is one of my favorite foods, that is a subjective fact. It's subjective to my taste. It relies on me, the subjective agent, for its truth. Now we're getting into what's called intrinsic value. Now, intrinsic value is value that exists in and of itself. And one of the best analogies I can give you is that people seek out happiness. And when they seek out happiness, that is the end goal, happiness itself. There's not anything beyond happiness. They don't seek happiness in order to get a different kind of happiness. Happiness is like the end goal. So happiness is sought out in and of itself. Happiness has value within itself that people seek out. So that's what's intrinsic. Now contrast this with what's called instrumental. Instrumental value is value that we seek as a means to an end. I sought out an education in order to achieve a certain life goal, to achieve a certain status. That status builds on itself to get to another different level, but all of it may be for happiness, maybe for glory, whatever it may be, but I was seeking it out as a means to an end. And when it's a means to an end, it's instrumental value. So that's what's meant by intrinsic value. In order for us to understand the distinction between intrinsic and derived intentionality, Searle provides us with three sentences. The first sentence is that I'm hungry right now. The second is a French sentence where he says, in French, j'ai grande faim en ce moment, means I am very hungry right now. That's his second sentence. And the third sentence is the plants in my garden are hungry for nutrients. Now, the first sentence is intrinsic in a very specific way. When I say I'm hungry, I first attribute intrinsic intentionality to me. It's the fact that I am in a state of hunger, and that state is attributed to me. I have it regardless of what anyone else thinks about it. I give rise to it, I create it, but more importantly, it has value because it's the state that I am in right now. Now contrast that with the second sentence. In French, j'ai grande faim en ce moment means I am very hungry right now. That second statement literally attributes intentionality. I mean, it does have intentionality to it. You understand it because you understand the intentionality of being hungry. But the intentionality of this French sentence is not intrinsic. It is derived from the intrinsic intentionality of the French speaker. They're literally giving you a translation. This sentence might have been used by the French person to mean something completely different. It could be a lesson, where the intentionality of the sentence isn't really derived from the intrinsic hunger of the person. They're just stating this sentence to teach someone what it means in French, or how to say the French sentence that they're hungry right now. It might have no intentionality to it whatsoever. It might be just purely education. So the value of this sentence, the meaning of this sentence, isn't intrinsic. It's not located within the sentence itself. It gets its meaning from our understanding of the sentence, our understanding of intentional states. And then Searle states that all linguistic meaning is derived intentionality. The words that we use to express our intentionality is not intrinsic. The intentionality itself is intrinsic. The words that we used are all derived. That is why Searle says the first sentence, that I am very hungry right now, attributes intrinsic intentionality to me. And this is going to make a lot more sense in a little bit as we get into the examples that he states. But let's go over this third sentence real quick. The fact that plants in my garden are hungry for nutrients. This third statement does not literally attribute any intentionality at all. And the reason he says this is because we don't know what plants can do. Obviously the sentence itself relies on an observer in order to understand. And we don't understand the hunger of a plant. We are ascribing to them an intentionality that Searle says they don't have. They may behave as if they do, but we're just ascribing what we understand as intentionality to them, as like kind of metaphorical. But returning to the distinction between derived intentionality and intrinsic intentionality, Searle says this is best explained or understood by the distinction between what is observer independent and observer dependent. And when he says observer, he literally means somebody on the outside who is trying to understand what you're expressing. So something that's observer independent is things like force, mass, gravitational attraction. These are observer independent. They exist regardless of anybody believing in their existence. They exist independent of anyone else. That's why they're observer independent. And then you have something that's observer dependent, such as a knife or a chair or a sentence in English. A sentence in English only makes sense from an observer who can understand the language that is being used. A chair only exists as a chair from our understanding of what it means to have a chair or to look at a chair. The chair's existence depends upon us. Therefore, it's observer dependent. So then he notices intentionality is observer independent. I have my state of hunger regardless of what any observer thinks. Yet derived intentionality, the derived intentionality of language, the derived intentionality as a whole is observer dependent. It is only in relation to the observer, the users, and so on, that a sentence in French has the meaning it has. It requires an observer to understand the language. Imagine a person speaking French in a completely English auditorium. none of the words, none of the sentences is going to have any meaning because no one else is going to be able to understand it. Even if the person is just sitting there saying, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, he has the observer independent aspect of being hungry, but the sentence itself, the words that he's using, relies on an observer in order for it to make sense. And that's why he said that all linguistic meaning is derived intentionality, because words are used to communicate. Words are useless if they don't have some type of aspect of communication associated. I may have intrinsic intentionality of certain states of desires, but when I am trying to communicate something, what is being communicated is derived from my intentional states. They themselves don't have the intrinsic value. They're derived from an intrinsic value. Words are used as a means to an end. Therefore, we have to separate the value of words from the value of our intrinsic intentionality, from our desires. So if I ask you, hint, hint, what does it mean to say that consciousness and or intentionality are observer independent? You can state that the features of the mind are observer independent in the sense that if I'm conscious or have an intentional state such as thirst, those features do not depend for their existence on anyone outside of me or what anyone outside of me thinks. Now, because Searle is a philosopher of science, he has to put in the book some kind of biological account of intentionality, because he doesn't want to fall into dualism where consciousness is an immaterial thought process. He wants to give an actual physical account for everything in his book. So quickly, I'll go over intentionality naturalized as a biological phenomena. When philosophers use naturalized, they mean explained in natural terms, physical terms, how certain aspects of the brain give rise to other aspects of the brain, physical aspects of the brain. So when he talks about intentionality, he gives us an example in what he calls the most biologically primitive forms of intentionality, which is desires that involve bodily needs such as hunger and thirst. So he explains a lack of water in the system causes the kidneys to secrete renin, and renin acts on a circulating peptide called angiotensin to make angiotensin 2, and this substance gets into the brain and attacks portions of the hypothalamus, causing an increase in the rate of neuron firing in those portions, and this in turn causes the animal to feel conscious desires to drink. And so this is an example of how biological phenomena creates intentionality within the consciousness of the mind. Then Searle gets into common misconceptions associated with this theory, but we really don't need to get into that. Just understand that he is going to give a biological account for brain states like consciousness and intentionality, because he's not a dualist, he's a materialist. And ultimately, he wants to explain how biology, how our natural biological selves create social facts and our social reality. All right, so now we're going to get into direction of fit. Now, Searle states that beliefs and hypotheses are said to be true or false depending on whether the world really is the way the belief represents it as being. So these kinds of intentional states are propositional states or propositional contents, because that which is propositional has the possibility of being true or false. So beliefs are different than desires, because for Searle, beliefs have mind-to-world direction of fit. Now, something with a mind-to-world direction of fit states that it's the responsibility of the belief or the mind to match an independently existing world. A good way to remember this distinction is mind to world, mind comes first. Mind has the power. It's the responsibility of the belief to match an independently existing world. In a mind to world, it's the responsibility of the mind to match an independently existing world. But desires and intentions, on the other hand, have a world to mind direction of fit. If a desire or intention is not satisfied, it is the responsibility not of the desire or intention, but of the world that it fails to match the content of the desire or intention. And he gives a great example for this distinction. Imagine a woman who gives a husband a shopping list. And on that shopping list, there's beer, butter, and bacon. Okay, this list functions like an order or desire, and thus has the world to list direction of fit. That's the desires and intentions that have a world to mind direction of fit. So it's the responsibility not of the desire, but of the world that it fails to match the content or desire of the intention. Okay, so imagine this husband goes to the supermarket and picks out groceries, but now a detective is following this man. And the detective writes that this person picked up beer, butter, and bacon. So that when they reach the checkout counter, both the man and detective have identical lists. You know, both of them have beer, butter, and bacon on their lists. The function of the detective's list, though, is radically different. It's the responsibility of the detective's list to match the independently existing reality. It has a mind to world direction of fit. And where this really gets hammered home is when you think about success or failures of the mind to world versus world to mind direction of fit. In the detective's list, which is mind to world, because he's simply writing what this person was collecting, if the detective's list is incorrect, he can just change it. You know, because the list is the one that has the power. It's the mind to world direction of fit. So we can just change our mind. You know, so he can scratch out the list. Say he wrote beer, butter, and instead of bacon, he put ham. He can just simply erase ham and write in bacon. He has that potential. He has that possibility because it's the responsibility of the mind to reflect the independently existing world, mind to world. But the husband, on the other hand, you know, he comes home and instead of bringing bacon, he brought ham. You know, same thing as the detective. But what happens here? The wife gets upset and tells him he's an idiot. But he cannot just simply scratch out his list and write in ham. You know, well, I mean, I guess he could trick the wife into saying, no, you told me ham, but that's not the purpose of this. The fact is the world has the power. The world has the power to fail or match the content or desires of the mind. So he cannot fix it. He would need to go back to the store. He would need to go back into the world and collect that which was missing. So, again, the detective's list functions like a belief, which has a mind-to-world direction of fit, and the husband's is a world-to-mind direction of fit. So beliefs, perceptions, and memories have a mind-to-world direction of fit. So when I believe something, when I believe in something, or I have a memory, or I have a perception, it is the responsibility of my mind to represent how things are. If it's incorrect, well, then I'm just going to have to change my belief. I'm going to have to change my perception. If my memory is incorrect, well, then I'm just going to have to change the way I remembered that thing so I can remember how things are. Not how I would like them to be, but how they are correctly represented. But I have that power because beliefs and perceptions have mind to world direction of it. When I have a desire and intention, it has a world to mind direction of fit because their aim is to represent not how things are, but how we would like them to be or how we plan to make them. I could plan to go into town and pick up a certain amount of groceries and come back home, but then as I'm going to town, a cow gets in my way, and, there's nothing I can do about it. I have to sit there and wait. I may have a desire or intention to get to the store, but regardless, the world has its own agenda. I may have a desire or intention to go drink water, but it is up to the world to provide me with that nourishment so that my desire is successful, so that my desire is fulfilled, so that my intention to go seek out that water is successful. But it's successful because the world provided it. Not because I changed my mind and changed my belief or changed my memory, because the world was successful in providing me that nourishment, providing me that water. But when I have a belief or perception about the world, it is the responsibility of my perception to match the world. And I hope this makes sense because his example is very clear. And it's good for you to understand that beliefs and perceptions have mind to world and what that means. And then, of course, desires and intentions, because we're talking about intentionality here, and how those have world to mind directions of fit. It's important for you to understand these distinctions. Now, this segues into something really interesting, conditions of satisfaction. Because he believes the key to understanding intentionality is through conditions of satisfaction. Beliefs can be true or false, and as we stated, a belief or perception about the world is true or false if it matches the independent existing world, and if the world is not the way I said the belief was, then I just have to change the belief so that it's true or false. It's not a novel idea. I know a lot of people do not want to change their beliefs. They'd rather the world change. But if you think about it, one's belief has the responsibility of matching the world. Sorry to say it. And guess what? Your belief is true or false if it does in fact match the world. And if the world doesn't match it, it's not the responsibility of the world to change. It is the responsibility of your belief to change the independent existing world. Your belief has the power. You are empowered in your belief to change. Desires, on the other hand, are either fulfilled or frustrated. A desire to go get a drink of water, a desire to go get some food is either fulfilled or frustrated based on the world providing for you. And your desire may not change. Your thirst is not going to be satiated until it is fulfilled. And it can be very frustrating if the world doesn't provide you with that nourishment. I can imagine a person stuck in the desert going through the same thing, being frustrated over and over again. No matter how much he wills it, the desire doesn't have the power of the belief. The desire is either going to be fulfilled or it's going to be frustrated. And it's going to be fulfilled or frustrated based on whether the world gives it to you or not. And then intentions are like desires. They're either going to be carried out or they're not going to be carried out. Because as Searle demonstrated earlier, it is not the intentions resolve or the intentions power to change its mind. It's the responsibility of the world to provide for that intention. So in both cases, the intentional state of having an intention or desire is satisfied or not, depending upon whether there is indeed a match between the propositional content and the reality that it's representing. And just as important, by their conditions of satisfaction, that's how you're going to understand them. If we want to know exactly what a person's intentional state is, we must ask ourselves, under what conditions exactly would it be satisfied or not satisfied? He gives an example of love, where he says, love may not have a condition of satisfaction because it doesn't have entire propositional content, but he quickly says that the intentional states associated with love do have propositional content and thus do have conditions of satisfaction. You know that one person cannot love, for example, without having a set of beliefs and desires regarding that person. And then those beliefs and desires are in a large part constitutive of that love that they have for that person. But the main thing here is that the conditions of satisfaction gives you a hint or informs you as to what kind of intentional state you're working with. Beliefs can be true or false, desires can be fulfilled or frustrated, intentions can be carried out or not carried out, but in each case the intentional state is satisfied or not, depending upon whether there is indeed a match between the propositional content, the true or falsity of the initial proposition, and the reality it represents. But the belief has the power to change and adhere to the world. So that's where its truth or falsity comes from. Desires, on the other hand, are only fulfilled if the world provides for those desires. And guess what? My intentions to fulfill those desires, or my intentions to seek out something can be carried out or not carried out, also depending upon if the world matches that intention or desire. So the conditions of satisfaction really provide keys to which kind of intentional state you're working with. And from conditions of satisfaction, we get into the way intentions relate to the outside world, because there is a causation here. If I have an intention or desire to go drink water, then there's this characteristic of my intention and a causal reaction in the world that fulfills that intention. So our minds are in this constant causal contact with the world. I mean, that's kind of obvious because our consciousness is in a causal relation from the world. I'm watching this timer move as I speak. I'm looking at a TV that's right next to me. I am listening to the rain that is falling on my roof. I can see the light that is in my room. I am in a constant causal connection with the world. So the mind has this amazing ability, this representing capacity and causal relation to the world that should mesh in some systematic way. And the way it meshes is called intentional causation. Now, Searle wants to be very clear here. When he talks about intentional causation, he doesn't mean causation the same way Hume did, where Hume talked about billiard ball causation. Because in billiard ball causation, as Hume demonstrated, you only have one act and then another act. The causal interaction isn't really understood. But when it comes to intentionality, either the cause is a representation of the effect, or the effect is the representation of the cause. I go and I drink water specifically because of my intention or desire to go drink that water. And I have the intention to go drink water through the understanding that there will be water out there in the world that I can go and fulfill my desire with. And the condition of satisfaction relies on the intention. So much so that the intention is satisfied only if the intention itself caused the rest of its conditions of satisfaction. I succeed in carrying out my intention to raise my arm if I raise my arm because my intention caused myself to raise my arm. If it is done without an intentional state, then it's like a reflex. There wasn't any intention behind the action. It was just simply a reflex. And I know these lines can get blurred when you talk about martial arts and their reflexes, but in order to do Searle justice, I think we can even explain martial artist reflexes in a specific intention or condition of satisfaction, because the way a martial artist trains to fine-tune their reactions or fine-tune their instincts is through a constant condition of satisfaction, to the point where a condition of satisfaction is satisfied over and over again, so that if that person is ever put in that specific instance, the connection between the intention and the satisfaction is carried out quicker. They train themselves to block a punch over and over again with the intention of blocking a punch. They put their hand up in a specific way. They have the mind's intention to put up the arm specifically to block an attack, but they do it over and over again so that the intention to reaction is quicker. So I think we can do it justice there. But the cause isn't an intentional cause or doesn't have intentionality assigned to it if the causation of the act wasn't performed because of the intention. If I raised my arm for no reason, it didn't have intentionality based on that. And that is really interesting here, because now we have an aspect of causation that necessarily promotes the effect and the intention. It promotes a conjunction between the two, and that they rely upon each other. So intentional causation, as he states, is very important for us to understand intentionality at all, because this causation is required. I must have the intentional state and then perform the action. But the action must be done because of the intentional state in order for intentionality to exist. Then Searle gets into the background of intentionality, but the background of intentionality is eventually concluded that it is just needed for us to have an understanding or function at all. So it's another presupposition. And with that, we have reached the conclusion of Chapter 4. Again, the most important parts are, you should understand intentional causation and the way they rely, or intentionality and the cause or the effect rely upon this causation. You should have a solid understanding of mind to world and world to mind, direction of fit. And then, of course, the intrinsic nature or the intrinsic value of intentionality and what it means for intrinsic intentionality to have a sort of observer independency. This marks the end of the lecture this week. As usual, check the weekly objectives to make sure you have completed all tasks. Next week is a combination of a review week and when the final exam will open. Double check the syllabus to know exactly when it opens and when it closes, because immediately after the final exam closes, Tarrant County requires that we submit the grades within 1 or 2 days, so there will be no makeups for the final exam. Have a great day.